This walk starts at St James's Underground station. This street has been called Petty France, or Little France, since the end of the 15th century, when it was popular with French wool merchants. Look across at the large bunker-like building opposite. It's the home of the Home Office, and you may recognise it from television news items. It was designed by Sir Basil Spence and built in 1976. Spence is better known and better loved for his redesign of Coventry Cathedral after it was bombed in the Second World War. Cross Petty France by the pedestrian crossing, and once you're across, turn and look back at the station building. It's the headquarters of London Underground. When it was built in 1929, it was the tallest building in London, 53 metres, or 175 feet. Charles Holden was the architect for 55 Broadway. Holden designed several underground stations in a far more modern style than this building. But 55 Broadway is interesting for several reasons. It has an unusual cruciform plan, that's 4 wings attached to a central core. And this allows all the offices to have outward-facing windows. Look to the left of the station entrance. A little way along there's a large stone carving over a doorway. It's a statue by Jacob Epstein and is called Night. There's another statue by Epstein, Day, on the far side of the building. Epstein was notorious for producing controversial sculptures. The managers of London Underground wanted nothing to do with him, but Holden was determined to have him involved in the scheme. So a compromise was reached. London Underground said Epstein could do the carvings so long as no one knew about it. A tent was erected, and Epstein was smuggled up a ladder each morning. Of course, word got about, and crowds started to gather each day, hoping for a glimpse of the famous sculptor. Sure enough, there was an outcry when the statues were unveiled. Weird, grotesque, hideous, bestial, thundered the critics. And then all the fuss died down. Holden brought in several other avant-garde artists. Look further up above Epstein's Night. At the top of the facade behind it, there's a carved relief representing the West Wind. This was Henry Moore's first public commission. You could walk around the building spotting reliefs by other promising young sculptors of the time, including one by Eric Gill. But without binoculars, it's difficult to see them properly. Turn your back on the station and walk up Queen Anne's Gate, to the right of the Home Office. And after a few metres it bends sharply to the right. Follow it round. We're now in one of the most complete early Georgian streets in London, and for me one of the most beautiful. The first section is the oldest. It dates from 1704 in the reign of Queen Anne. Walk along the right-hand side and look at the ornate timber canopies over the doors of these houses. I read somewhere that they were probably carved by naval craftsmen who would normally have been carving buxom ships' figureheads. Stand for a moment outside number 17. There are certain architectural clues that tell us these houses must have been built before 1707. Take a look up at the white painted timber cornice along the roof eaves. Timber cornices were banned by an Act of Parliament in 1707 because they were a fire hazard. Stone had to be used instead of vertical brick parapets. The aim was to prevent flames spreading across rooftops. The Act was a response to the Great Fire of London in 1666, hardly a knee-jerk reaction. 2 years later, another Act ruled that windows must be set 4 inches back from the face of a building for the same reason. And in this section of Queen Anne's Gate, a lot of the windows are almost flush with the wall. This is a useful dating guide, but more often than not I find it doesn't work. Perhaps builders then as now found a way around the building regulations. We're still outside number 17. From 1910 to 1931, it was the office of Sir Edwin Lutyens, one of the great English architects of the last century, and certainly one of the most entertaining. The carved face to the right of the door, sticking out its tongue, must have amused him each time he entered his office, Lutyens was a notorious joker. At number 28 there's a blue plaque to the politician Lord Haldane, the first of many blue plaques in this street. Almost opposite, at the kink in the road, there's a statue of Queen Anne in her coronation regalia. Locals used to believe that on the anniversary of her death she came down off her plinth and walked 3 times round the street. Carry on down Queen Anne's Gate. You'll quickly spot the difference between the houses in this part of the street and the earlier part. They don't have the same rich variety. This is because design manuals started to appear in the 18th century, and they would have been used by the craftsmen working on these houses. Door surrounds, fan lights, banister rails, paint composition, every aspect of the building was becoming standardized. The metal supports for oil lamps on the left-hand side of the street are a good example. They're splendid, but they're all the same. There are blue plaques galore here because we're close to the Houses of Parliament, and this would have been a convenient place for politicians to live. It still is, but by now most of the houses have been converted into offices. At the end of Queen Anne's Gate you come to the Two Chairmen. This was a sedan chair pick-up point in the days when people travelled in sedan chairs, and it was a risky method of transport to judge by an account in the diary of Fanny Burney. Fanny is trying to get to St. James's Palace, where she is employed as a companion to George III's wife, Queen Charlotte.
"I know where the lady lives well enough," cried one of the chairmen. "'Tis in St. James's Street." "No, no," cried I, "'tis in St. James's Palace." "Up with the chair," cried the other man. "I know best. 'Tis in South Audley Street. I know the lady well enough." Think what a situation. I found they had both been drinking the Queen's health till they knew not what they said and could with difficulty stand.
Turn left in front of the Two Chairmen and go down Cockpit Steps. A delightful surprise if you don't already know them. In the early 1700s there was a cockfighting theatre nearby, and hence the name. At the bottom of Cockpit Steps, cross directly over the road into St. James's Park. This is Birdcage Walk, and I'll explain the name later. Once you are on the park side of the road, follow the path which runs on a diagonal to the right. We're heading for a small cottage at the end of the lake. As you draw near to the lake, you'll get a clear view of the backs of the government offices along Whitehall, flanking the park on your right. The cottage was built for the Ornithological Society in the mid-19th century. It's been described as one of the most desirable residences in London, though no one actually lives here. I'm always impressed by how beautifully the garden is kept, and the way all the plants are labelled. The island behind the cottage, Duck Island, is a haven for waterfowl. There's a good chance you'll see some of the 5 resident pelicans. Pelicans have been here since the Russian ambassador presented a pair to King Charles II in the 1660s. John Evelyn, the naturalist and diary writer, who is a contemporary of the King's, came to the park to examine the strange, melancholy waterfowl, as he called them. But he was amused by the way the pelican ate.
It was diverting to see how he would toss up and turn a flat fish, plaice or flounder, to get it right into its gullet at its lower beak, which, being filmy, stretched to a prodigious wideness when it devours a great fish.
Some 2.5 centuries later, an American poet, Dixon Merritt, was equally intrigued by the pelican's eating habits and wrote a limerick on the subject.
Oh, a wondrous bird is the pelican. His bill holds more than his belly can. He can take in his beak enough food for a week, but I'm darned if I know how the hell he can.
As you continue round the edge of the lake, you will come to a curved timber and glass building called In the Park, spelled I-N-N. It was designed by Michael Hopkins Architects. It has an environmentally friendly sloping grass roof. In 1531, Henry VIII bought the site as a marshy field of about 90 acres together with St. James's Leper Hospital for Women. He rebuilt the hospital as St. James's Palace, where he lived briefly with Anne Boleyn, and turned the land into a deer park to hunt in. Almost a century later, James I added a menagerie containing 2 crocodiles and built a series of aviaries along the southern boundary. This explains Birdcage Walk, which we crossed earlier on our way into the park. The park was in effect the palace garden, so it has endless associations with the monarchs who lived here. When Charles I was condemned to be beheaded in 1649, he walked across the park on a freezing January morning to his execution in Whitehall, followed by his dog Rogue. But for his son Charles II, the park was a much happier place. He redesigned it after his restoration in 1660 in the formal French style, and he may have been helped by the French landscape architect Le Nôtre, who was Louis XIV's architect at Versailles. There was a canal running through it from east to west, and on old maps it looks like a private runway. It sometimes froze over in winter, and on December the 1st, 1662, Samuel Pepys records in his diary that it was in St. James's Park
where I first in my life, it being a great frost, did see people sliding with their skates, which is a very pretty art.
Later in the month, he watched his employer, the Duke of York, skating.
Though the ice was broken and dangerous, yet he would go slide upon his skates, which I did not like, but he slides very well.
It's mostly through Pepys's diaries that we know how much Charles enjoyed the park. He came here to feed the birds, play with his spoiled spaniels, chat with his mistresses. Nell Gwyn had a house overlooking the park and could call to him as he passed. And he even swam in the canal on hot days. Pepys himself, tired from his work as a naval secretary, sometimes lay on the grass and catnapped. In the 18th century, the park became a place of ill repute. Here's another diary writer, James Boswell.
20th of March, 1763. I felt a carnal inclination. I went into St. James's Park and picked up a whore. 24th of June, the King's birthday. I went into St. James's Park and picked up a young brimstone. I agreed with her for 6 pence. We went to the bottom of the park, arm in arm. I dipped my machine in the canal and performed most manfully.
There's nothing formal or French about the park today, and the canal has gone. Instead, everything is curved and natural looking. It's the perfect English garden. The architect John Nash redesigned it in 1828 to fit in with the fashion for naturalness that came in with the Romantic movement at the turn of the century. Enjoy the views from the bridge. Buckingham Palace to the west, the London Eye to the east, erected for the millennium and designed by 2 young architects, David Marks and Julia Barfield. Before moving off the bridge, see if you can spot the bronze plaque set into the paving. This is one of 90 plaques marking a 7-mile memorial walk in memory of Princess Diana. We're now on the Mall. The broad road we see today was built in 1911 to form a grand ceremonial route from Admiralty Arch to Buckingham Palace. But the original Mall was a much narrower track, and it's still on the far side of the present Mall. Before we cross over, look across at Marlborough House, the large red brick building on the opposite right-hand corner. It was designed by Christopher Wren for the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough in 1711. It's now the international headquarters of the Commonwealth Office. The ground floor rooms are spectacular, and it's worth trying to get in to see them during open house weekend. Walk up Marlborough Road, opposite the park gateway. Stop when you reach a courtyard, Friary Court, on your left. Friary Court is part of St. James's Palace. Over the years, the palace has been heavily restored, and much of it, including Friary Court, was damaged by fire in 1809. Look at how patchy the brickwork is. It's all done at different times. When the reigning monarch dies, the new monarch is proclaimed from the long balcony across the back of the courtyard. The florid bronze monument on your right is dedicated to the memory of Queen Alexandra of Denmark, wife of Edward VII. It was designed by the sculptor Alfred Gilbert, and his best-known work is the statue of Eros in Piccadilly. The next building you come to on the right is the Queen's Chapel, designed by Inigo Jones in 1627. From the outside, this church looks like a townhouse. I've seen net curtains in the lower windows, and it's quite easy to walk past without realizing that it is in fact a chapel. It's also an architectural landmark because it's the first church in England to be based on the classical architecture of ancient Rome. Inigo Jones was inspired by Renaissance architecture when he visited Italy, and he had an enormous influence on later architects like Wren and Hawksmoor. You can see inside the chapel if you attend a service on Sundays between Easter and July. The times are posted up on the door. Before you leave Marlborough Road, have a look at two small details. They're on the left above a doorway to apartment 29, two little iron plaques. The letters SMF on one refer to the parish of St. Martin in the Fields. You can just make out St. Martin giving his cloak to a beggar. The other, bearing the letters SJW and the number 65, is a ward boundary mark for St. James's, Westminster. You'll start to notice more of these plaques on walks around London once you know what to look for. Turn left and walk towards the Palace Gatehouse. In front of the palace, Pall Mall sweeps around into St. James's Street. The name comes from the Italian Palio a Maglio, a game that sounds like a mix between croquet and lacrosse. It involved hitting a ball through a raised hoop, and it was the rage in 16th and 17th century Europe. Charles II first played Pall Mall here, but passing horses and carriages created too much dust, and he moved his pitch down to the Mall. The name moved with the game. Standing with your back to the palace and the sentry guard, you have a good view of the two end buildings on either side of St. James's Street. They're an interesting pair, both built for the Alliance Assurance Company. And they're both by the same architect, Sir Norman Shaw. But they were built over 20 years apart, and they couldn't be more different in appearance. The one on the right, number 1 St. James's Street, is the earlier, 1882. It's a cheerful building with lively red and white banding, carved panels under the windows, and curly-Q stepped edges up the roof gable, and there are miniature windows in the corner tower. It's a typical example of Shaw's exuberant early free style. It was very influential. You'll see lots of other offices like this around the West End. The semicircular ground floor windows were new to London at the time. They let more light into the building, and they encouraged window shopping. Number 88 on the opposite corner, 1903, is classical and serious, but Shaw had problems with the site. Edward VII, who was then king, let it be known that he was concerned about the outlook from the palace. Window shopping was not to be encouraged. So Shaw could only put arched windows on the facade on St. James's Street, where they wouldn't cause royal offence. Take a few moments to turn and admire St. James's Palace. It's the oldest building on this walk. All that remains of the original exterior of Henry VIII's palace is the guarded gatehouse with its octagonal turrets. The interior, closed to the public, is an assortment of additions and repairs made over the years by a string of illustrious architects and craftsmen. All the great names have had a hand in it: Wren, Grinling Gibbons, Nash, William Morris, etc. But as I'm not likely to get inside, I'm happy to concentrate on the exterior. There's one part that the public can get into, and that's the Chapel Royal for Sunday services at certain times of the year. You can see the tall Gothic windows to the right of the gateway. Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in the Chapel Royal, and this was where Diana, Princess of Wales, lay in state before her funeral. Number 3, Berry Brothers in Rudd. The firm traces its history back as far as 1698. The swinging sign above the entrance dates from the days when the shop was a grocery and sold coffee as well as food and wine. The quaint ye olde front and the ground floor were redesigned in the Regency period. If you're interested in the wine or in seeing more of the building, you could ask about wine tasting sessions. They are held in the cellars, which extend out under the street, and they're much larger than you'd expect. Immediately beyond Berry Brothers, turn right into a narrow panel passage which takes us into the smallest public square in London, and for me one of the most charming. Pickering Place was named after one of the first owners of Berry Brothers, a Mr. Pickering, and he was responsible for building this court. The houses date from the 1730s. Have a look at the windows. The rule of thumb I mentioned back in Queen Anne's Gate, houses post 1709 having their windows set back 4 inches, fails here as it so often does. The older houses are all occupied by Berry Brothers offices. I've asked the staff if they know who the carved relief chained to the railings represents. They suggested Lord Palmerston, and it does indeed look like him, but goodness knows what he's doing here. And I'd love to know if there's any truth in the rumour that the last duel in London was fought here. But there's no evidence that it was, and it's probably just an urban legend. Weren't pistol duels normally fought in misty open spaces at dawn, with no windows in sight? Green Park is only a few paces away. This is one of the few places in London where lamps are still fuelled by gas. As you go back down the passage to St. James's Street, don't miss the small plaque on the left at the end. It commemorates the legation of the short-lived Republic of Texas, which had its headquarters at Berry Brothers after it seceded from Mexico. Look across at number 78. It used to be the home of the Conservative Club. It was designed in 1843 by George Besavi and Sidney Smirke. Smirke also designed the British Museum. Besavi was a pupil of the architect Sir John Soane. He designed the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge and fell to his death from the tower of Ely Cathedral. A couple of steps further up St. James's Street and we're at number 6, the Hatters Lock and Company. They've been trading here since 1765. This was where the bowler hat originated. Notice the windows below street level either side of the door. Inside the shop there's a coffin staircase. These were quite common in Elizabethan times. A coffin staircase has a rectangular stairwell just large enough for a coffin to be lowered down through the house feet first in the event of anyone dying on the top floors. Again, do go inside. The staff are wonderfully friendly and they'll point you to the staircase and a display cabinet containing one of Lord Nelson's cocked hats. Nelson was a regular customer and he paid his last bill for £11.19 and sixpence the day before he set sail on HMS Victory, heading for victory and death at the Battle of Trafalgar. Moving on, beyond locks is Byron House, with a modern glass entrance. This was where, in a former building on this site, Byron woke to find himself famous in 1812, on the morning after the publication of the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Continue up to King Street and stop at the corner. From here, look across St. James's Street at the classical building behind blue railings. It's the Carlton, the traditional club of the Conservative Party. When Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, she had to be made an honorary male in order to be eligible for membership of the Carlton. And many clubs still only admit women as members' guests. The Carlton was damaged by an IRA bomb in 1990. Cross King Street to reach the last shop we'll visit, the cigar merchant's James Fox at number 19. There may be a Red Indian or two on the pavement outside the door to welcome you. It's worth braving the interior if you're not put off by cigar smoke. Puffing customers are invited to relax and help themselves to free cups of coffee. And by mid-afternoon the atmosphere is much as I imagine it must have been in the 18th century. There's a miniature cigar museum at the back of the shop, and it's full of interesting memorabilia. Winston Churchill was introduced to Fox's by his mother, and he remained a valued client all his life. There's a letter on display in the museum from his secretary.
8th of October 1963. Dear Sirs, confirming our telephone conversation, Sir Winston Churchill would be much obliged if you would send a box of 25 cigars of good quality, but not as good as the Romeo and Juliet, and of medium size to his grandson for his birthday on October the 10th. I enclose a note to go with the parcel. Yours faithfully, Doreen Pugh, Private Secretary.
When you come out of Fox's, turn left, go back to King Street and cross St. James's Street by the pedestrian crossing. This takes us to the corner of St. James's Place. By now you'll probably have noticed the monstrous building on the corner of St. James's Place, number 67 Drambuie House, built in 1984. Back in the 1980s, a member of the now defunct Fine Arts Commission, Lady Airlie, described this building, for which she and other members of the Commission had given planning permission, as
the ghastly, shit-coloured building on St. James's.
Walk down St. James's Place. Number 4 on the right has a blue plaque to the composer and pianist Frédéric Chopin. The inscription reads, "From this house Frédéric Chopin went to the Guildhall to give his last public performance." Chopin fled from the 1848 uprising in Paris and spent 3 miserable months in Scotland and England. He left the country on the 23rd of November and died of consumption a year later. Keep going to the corner where St. James's Place widens into a turning space for carriages. The splendid stone mansion in the corner is Spencer House, designed in 1766 by John Vardy for the Spencers, parents of the legendary Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and ancestors of Diana, Princess of Wales. The modern building at right angles to Spencer House, number 26 St. James's Place, is a block of luxurious flats designed by Sir Denis Lasdun and built in 1960. Lasdun also designed the National Theatre on the South Bank. His work is often described as brutalist, based on his liking for raw concrete. But here he has used polished granite, steel columns and bronze window frames, and the flats have magnificent views over a green park. Before you turn to leave St. James's Place, glance at the blue plaque at number 28, to the left of Spencer House. It commemorates the Member of Parliament William Huskisson, killed by Stephenson's rocket during its inaugural journey on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. Huskisson was a pioneer of free trade and campaigned to improve trading conditions with the colonies. According to his recent biographer, Simon Garfield, Huskisson was fatally accident-prone. As a boy, he fractured his arm doing his homework. His horse fell on him just before his marriage. He collided with a carriage pole, landed short jumping a moat and sprained his ankle, broke his arm twice, and so on. He was unwell on the day of his death and had been told by his doctor to stay at home. But he disobeyed his doctor's orders with fatal consequences. Now back to St James's Street. Turn left and find the entrance to Blue Ball Yard. This is a mid-18th century stable yard, still complete with stables, although they're now guest suites and bedrooms owned by the Stafford Hotel. Look at the names above the doors on the left. They're all connected with horse racing. There's the painter Stubbs, horse breeder Lord Godolphin, and star racehorses like Red Rum, 3 times winner of the Grand National. In the right-hand corner of the yard, behind a trellis, you will find one of the hotel bars. The ceiling is festooned with sports caps. Back on St James's Street, turn left, and 3 doors further on you pass Justerini and Brooks, makers of J&B whisky. The 3 most ancient and exclusive London clubs are clustered together at this end of the street. The first, Brooks's, is in front of you on the far corner of Park Place. Look at the fine Venetian windows at first floor level on the side wall. And then cross Park Place and look behind the club railings at the fine pair of lead planters stamped 1776, the year of the American War of Independence, the year that the architect Henry Holland began designing this building for members of the Whig Party. The Whigs supported America's struggle for independence. Charles James Fox was a founder member. As well as being one of the outstanding politicians of his day, he was a prodigious gambler. He's said to have lost 1,000 guineas at a single gambling session, which lasted for 22 hours. More recently and soberly, another member, the composer Edward Elgar, in sponge-bag trousers and white spats, would be summoned to the telephone by the hall porter to listen to his dogs barking their daily greeting from his home in Worcestershire. The club's gambling reputation was a thing of the past by Elgar's time. In fact, none of the members you may see coming out of the club look as if they've been doing anything more reckless than reading a copy of the day's Times. Look across the street at another of the great 3, Boodle's, designed by John Crunden in 1775. The beautiful white Venetian window resembles the work of Robert Adams, who was at the height of his fame when Boodle's was being built. Boodle's was said to be favoured by country gentlemen. It had a staid, non-political reputation. It used to have what was called a dirty room, for anyone who was not properly dressed for the dining room, and, evidently, but I'm not sure I believe this, coins were boiled before being handed to members. Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, was a member of Boodle's. Continue walking up this side of the street, crossing Jermyn Street. White's is the second building on your right after Jermyn Street. It stands behind railings and has fine wrought-iron lanterns either side of the doorway. In 1811 the door was moved to its present position to make space for the ground floor bow window, in which dandies like the fashion leader Beau Brummel would pose to attract attention. Go and have a look through the railings under the bow window, and you'll see that the old front steps are still there, propping up the window. White's is the oldest of the three great clubs. It began as White's Chocolate House in 1693 and moved to several other addresses on the street before settling here. In contrast to Brooks's, it was a Tory club, but that didn't stop members like Beau Brummell belonging to both. What mattered to men of fashion in the 18th century was having as many places to gamble as possible, and White's was known as the most fashionable hell in London. Hell was slang for a gambling house. There was nothing that members of White's would not bet on. The letter writer and dilettante Horace Walpole, writing in 1750, describes a typical episode.
September the 1st, 1750. They've put in the papers a good story made at White's. A man dropped down dead at the door and was carried in. The club immediately made bets whether he was dead or not, and when they were going to bleed him, the wagerers for his death interposed and said it would affect the fairness of the bet.
We've now reached the end of the walk.